April 27, 1945, the Munich-Salzburg Autobahn. The war in Europe was in its final spasms. The Third Reich, which had promised to last for 1,000 years, had only days left to live. As the armored columns of the U.S. 7th Army pushed south through the Bavarian pine forests, the soldiers were exhausted. They were expecting to fight die-hard SS units or terrified teenage conscripts armed with Panzerfausts. They were expecting roadblocks. They were expecting ambushes. But as they rolled down the A8 Autobahn near the town of Leipheim, they found something that made the tank commanders stop their engines and stare in disbelief. The highway didn't look like a highway anymore. The center median, usually a grassy strip dividing the traffic, had been ripped out and paved over with fresh, hasty concrete. The white lane markers were gone, painted over with a strange, textured green paste, and the guardrails had been cut away, creating dirt paths that vanished into the dense, dark tree line. Cautiously, the American infantry dismounted. Rifles raised, they followed the muddy tracks into the shadows of the forest. 10 yards in, 20 yards in, and there they were. Not tanks, not bunkers, but spaceships. Dozens of them, sleek silver and green sharks sitting in the mud. They had swept back wings. They had engines underslung like pods, scorched from heat. They looked fast even when they were sitting still. These were Messerschmitt Me-262s, the world's first operational jet fighters. For 2 years, Allied intelligence had feared these machines. They were the wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen. They were monsters capable of screaming through the sky at 540 miles per hour, armed with 4 30mm cannons that could disintegrate a B-17 bomber in a single burst. The Allies assumed these high-tech beasts operated from massive concrete fortresses. But here they were, sitting under pine branches, covered in wet tarps, hidden like forgotten toys in the woods. The soldiers had stumbled upon the final, desperate secret of the Luftwaffe. When the Allied bombers turned the German airfields into the surface of the moon, the Nazis didn't stop flying. They simply moved. They turned their own highway system into a runway. They turned the forests into hangars, and they turned the roadside ditches into the most advanced, high-tech workshops on Earth. This is the story of the Autobahn airfields. It is the story of how a dying Air Force tried to hide an entire fleet of 1,400 jet fighters under the canopy of the German woods. It is a story of impossible engineering, of oxen towing 20th century jets, and of the desperate race to keep the miracle weapons flying even as the world burned around them.
Late 1944, the skies over Germany. To understand why the Luftwaffe ended up hiding in the bushes, you have to look at the sky. By late 1944, the air war was no longer a contest, it was a slaughter. The U.S. 8th Air Force and the British RAF owned the airspace over Europe. They were pounding Germany around the clock with a strategy known as the oil plan. They bombed the synthetic fuel plants, they bombed the refineries, they strangled the mechanical heart of the German war machine. But then, they switched targets. They went after the concrete. General Jimmy Doolittle and the Allied planners realized a simple truth. You don't have to shoot down a plane if it has nowhere to take off. Every major German airbase, from Frankfurt to Berlin, from Aachen to Rhine, was being systematically pulverized. The moment a German repair crew filled a crater on a runway, a flight of B-17s would return the next day and dig it up again. They were cratering the Luftwaffe into submission. This was a catastrophe for the Germans because of one specific technological irony. The Luftwaffe had the best plane in the world, the Me-262. It was 100 miles faster than the American P-51 Mustang. It could outclimb and outdive anything the Allies had. But a jet fighter has a weakness. It is a diva. A propeller plane, like a Bf-109, is rugged. It can take off from grass, dirt, or a bumpy field. The big propeller blows debris away from the engine. A jet is different. The Jumo U-004 turbine engines were essentially giant vacuum cleaners. They sucked in massive amounts of air. If they sucked in a single pebble, a clump of mud, or a loose bolt, the turbine blades would shatter and the engine would explode. The Me-262 needed concrete. It needed a long, smooth, hard surface, and it needed a lot of it, at least 1,500 meters to get airborne. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe High Command faced a crisis. They had hundreds of new jets rolling off the assembly lines. They had desperate pilots ready to fly, but they had literally nowhere to launch them. They needed a surface that was long, straight, paved, and indistinguishable from the air. And then, a frantic engineer looked at a map of the Reich's Autobahn.
The Autobahn was Adolf Hitler's pride and joy. Built in the 1930s, it was the first high-speed road network in the world. It was designed to move tanks and supply trucks rapidly across the Reich. But the engineers noticed something specific about certain sections of the highway, particularly the A8, Munich to Salzburg, and the A9, Berlin to Munich. They were perfectly straight for miles. They were made of high-quality, heavy-load concrete, and crucially, they were lined with dense, old-growth forests. The order went out: turn the roads into runways. This was not as simple as landing on a road. A highway is designed for cars, not 7-ton combat aircraft landing at 120 miles per hour. The organization TOT, the massive civil and military engineering group of the Reich, mobilized thousands of workers and slave laborers. They descended on specific sectors of the Autobahn with a frantic speed. The modification process. First, they had to deal with the median strip. The Autobahn had a grassy divider down the middle. This was a death trap for aircraft gear. Crews tore out the grass and soil. They filled the gap with gravel and poured quick-drying concrete, smoothing it to match the level of the road lanes. This turned 2 narrow lanes into one massive 80-foot-wide runway. Second, they had to deal with the visibility. A giant strip of fresh white concrete stands out like a beacon to Allied bombers, so they developed a special camouflage paint, a textured green paste. They painted over the white traffic lines. They painted fake cracks and potholes onto the runway so that from 20,000 feet, it looked like a ruined, unusable country road. Third, they built the infrastructure. You can't just park a jet on the shoulder. They bulldozed gaps in the guardrails. They laid down timber planks and gravel to create taxiways leading off the asphalt and deep into the tree line. They created a network of shadow airfields. On Allied maps, these were just transit routes. American reconnaissance photos showed empty roads. Traffic would flow normally during the day, trucks, cars, refugees. But when the air raid sirens wailed, the military police would block the road, the traffic would stop, the camouflage nets would be pulled back, and suddenly, the morning commute would be interrupted by the scream of jet engines.
Early 1945, the Kuno complex. Hiding the runway was only half the battle. Hiding the industry was the other. By 1945, the major aircraft factories, Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel, had been bombed into dust. But production couldn't stop. So the Luftwaffe adopted a strategy called decentralization. They broke the factories into tiny pieces and scattered them into the woods. These were called Waldwerke, forest factories. The most famous of these was the Kuno 1 complex near Leipheim. If you walked through these forests in March 1945, you would see a sight that looked like science fiction meeting the Stone Age. There were no hangars, there were no roofs. Instead, there were high-tech assembly lines running between the pine trunks. The production line. Station 1, a clearing where wings were stored under camouflage nets. Station 2, 100 yards away, fuselages sat on wooden cradles. Station 3, jet engines arrived by rail and night, offloaded onto trucks and hoisted onto the airframes using simple pulleys attached to sturdy oak branches. The camouflage was obsessive. Every plane was covered in netting. The wings were painted with dark green splinter patterns to match the forest floor. From the air, it was invisible. From the ground, it was a hive of activity. But the most bizarre aspect of the forest airfields was the logistics of movement. Germany was critically short on fuel. They barely had enough J-2 jet fuel to fly the combat missions. They certainly didn't have enough to taxi the planes from the deep forest assembly areas to the highway runway. Starting a jet engine just to move the plane 500 yards was a waste of precious resources they couldn't afford. So, they went medieval. The world's most advanced flying machines, Aircraft that touched the edge of the speed of sound were towed out of the forest by oxen and horses. Local farmers were conscripted. Imagine the scene: a Bavarian farmer leading a mud-caked ox, pulling a wooden cart, and hitched to that cart is a sleek, silver jet fighter bristling with 30mm cannons. It was the ultimate contrast of World War II, the 19th century dragging the 20th century through the mud. This system worked. At the Kuno complex alone, they were churning out multiple jets a day, assembling them under the trees, dragging them to the Autobahn, and launching them into the fight.
March 19, 1945, Sector Munich-Augsburg. For the pilots of JV-44, Jagdverband 44, the legendary squadron of aces led by Adolf Galland, flying off the Autobahn was a terrifying gamble. These men were the elite. They had hundreds of kills, but taking off from a highway required nerves of steel. The danger: the Autobahn runway was narrow. On a normal airfield, if a tire blows or a gust of wind hits you, you drift onto the grass. On the Autobahn, if you drift left or right, you hit a concrete bridge abutment, a drainage ditch, or a solid wall of pine trees. There was no margin for error. And then there was the JATO problem. The highway sections were often too short for a fully loaded Me-262 carrying bombs or full fuel tanks. The early jet engines had terrible acceleration at low speeds. They needed time to spool up. To fix this, the ground crews bolted Rauchgeräte, rocket assist takeoff units, under the fuselage. These were liquid-fueled rockets designed to kick the plane into the air. The procedure: the ox teams drag the jet to the asphalt. The farmer unhooks the beast and runs for cover. The pilot runs up the turbines. He stands on the brakes until the plane is shaking violently. The noise is deafening, echoing off the trees, shaking the leaves. Brakes released, the jet lurches forward. Halfway down the highway at about 100 miles per hour, the pilot hits the ignition button. Boom! 2 rockets ignite, spewing a trail of white smoke. The pilot is slammed back into his seat with thousands of pounds of extra thrust. The plane leaps off the highway, clearing the treetops by inches, retracting its gear just as the road curves away. For the American bomber crews high above, it was a nightmare. They would look down at a quiet country road, seeing nothing but trees, and suddenly a flight of jets would materialize out of the ground, climbing vertically on pillars of smoke to intercept them. The Autobahn airfields were effective. The Ghost Fleet was flying. But the Allies were not stupid. They noticed the smoke trails, they noticed the scorch marks on the roads, and they realized that while they couldn't catch the jets in the air, they could catch them on the ground. They decided to play a new game. They called it rat catching. April 19, 1945. The U.S. Army Air Force and the RAF realized they had to change tactics. You don't chase a shark in the open ocean. You catch it when it returns to its cave. American P-51 Mustang and British Hawker Tempest pilots began flying roaming missions. They weren't escorting bombers anymore. They were hunters. They flew up and down the German Autobahns at low altitude, looking for the telltale signs: straight sections of road with no civilian cars, black scorch marks on the asphalt, gaps in the trees where taxiways had been cut. Then they waited. They circled high in the sun, thousands of feet above the forest airfields, waiting for the German jets to return from a mission. This was the Me-262's most vulnerable moment. Returning from a fight, the German pilot was exhausted. He was low on fuel. He had to slow down to 150 miles per hour to drop his gear and flaps. He had to line up perfectly with a narrow road. That's when the rats would pounce. The Mustangs would dive from 10,000 feet, screaming down on the helpless jets. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. German pilots were shot down while on final approach, unable to maneuver. They were shot down while taxiing on the ground. Some were strafed while they were still being towed by the oxen back into the trees. General Adolf Galland described the chaos of these final weeks. He spoke of taking off while American fighters were strafing the other end of the road. He spoke of landing his jet, the engines flaming out from lack of fuel, and immediately jumping out of the cockpit to dive into a ditch as P-47 Thunderbolts turned his million-mark aircraft into a fireball. The Autobahn became a graveyard. The The forests were filling up with wreckage, burning aluminum, shattered glass, and the bodies of pilots who had survived the air war, only to die on a highway ramp. But the Germans had one final card to play. As the American tanks closed in on the ground, squeezing the Reich from the west, the order came from Berlin. Operation Clausewitz. It was the order to consolidate the final desperate stand. Every flyable jet, every prototype, every experimental wing was ordered to retreat to the south, to the Alpine Redoubt. The forests of Bavaria were about to become the final parking lot for the entire Luftwaffe.
May 19, 1945, southern Germany. The war in Europe ended not with a bang, but with a strange, eerie silence in the Bavarian woods. As the U.S. 7th Army and the French 1st Army swept through the area south of Munich and near Salzburg, they began to find them. At first, it was just one or two. A GI would push aside a camouflage net near the A8 Autobahn and find a jet. Then they found 10. Then they found 100. The sheer scale of the discovery was staggering. Along the Munich-Salzburg Autobahn alone, near the Horgau and Leipheim forests, American troops counted hundreds of aircraft. They found Me-262s lined up bumper to bumper in the ditches. They found Arado AR-234 jet bombers, the first of their kind, sitting in clearings. They found the Heinkel HE-162 Volksjäger, People's Fighter, a tiny wooden jet fighter with the engine mounted on top, designed to be flown by Hitler Youth. It was a technological graveyard. The pilots were gone, the mechanics were gone, the oxen were gone. All that was left were the machines. But these machines weren't just abandoned, they were murdered. The German crews, realizing they couldn't escape, had followed their final orders: destroy the technology. They had smashed the delicate glass cockpits with rifle butts. They had fired Panzerfausts into anti-tank rockets. They had placed grenades in the landing gear wells. The Americans found the most advanced air force in the world, but it was a ghost fleet, a collection of 1,400 shattered dreams rotting in the rain.
The investigation begins. The initial awe quickly turned to caution. The forests were dangerous. The retreating SS and Luftwaffe ground crews had rigged the forest airfields with booby traps. They wired explosives to the cockpit canopies. If a curious American soldier opened the hatch to grab a souvenir, the plane would blow up. But the danger didn't stop the intelligence officers. They knew what they were looking at. Standard Allied fighters like the P-51 or Spitfire were propeller-driven relics compared to what was sitting in these woods. The German jets had swept wings, a design that delayed the shock waves of breaking the sound barrier. Axial flow turbojets, engines that were far more advanced than the centrifugal jets the British were building. Ejection seats, the first operational use of explosive seats to save pilots. This wasn't just scrap metal, this was the future of aviation. And then, deep in the Ötztal Alps, they found something even stranger. They found a wind tunnel. A massive high-speed wind tunnel hidden inside a mountain powered by a hydroelectric dam. Inside were models of aircraft that looked like they belonged in Star Wars. Flying wings, the Horton HO-229, ramjet missiles, rocket planes that could reach space. The Allies realized with horror that if the war had lasted another 6 months, the skies over Europe would have been filled with these monsters. The Autobahn airfields were just the tip of the iceberg.
June 1945. The shooting war was over. The Cold War had begun. The United States and the Soviet Union were technically allies, but both sides knew the truth. Whoever controlled the German technology would rule the skies for the next 50 years. The U.S. Army Air Force launched a top-secret mission, Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe's secret technology. The leader was Colonel Harold Watson. His team was called Watson's Whizzers. Their mission was simple: go into the German forests, find the jets that weren't destroyed, steal them before the Russians or the French get them, ship them to America. It was a scavenger hunt on a continental scale. Watson's men scoured the Autobahn strips. They found the Waldwerk factories. They bartered cigarettes and coffee with captured German mechanics to get them to repair the jets. They found about 10 flyable Me-262s in the chaotic mess of the Lechfeld Air Base, but they had a problem. They didn't know how to fly them. So they hired the enemy. They took captured German test pilots out of the POW camps. They put them back in the cockpits of their own jets, planes with the swastikas hastily painted over with American stars, and told them, "Teach us how to fly this thing, or you go back to the cage." It was a surreal sight. American officers learning to fly Nazi jets, taught by Nazi pilots, taking off from Nazi highways, all while Soviet troops were just a few miles away, demanding access to the technology.
Cherbourg Harbor, France, July 1945. Watson's Whizzers managed to salvage about 100 significant aircraft. They loaded them onto the British aircraft carrier HMS Reaper. The decks were crowded with Me-262s, Arado bombers, and Heinkel fighters. These were the golden ticket planes. They were going to Wright Field in Ohio to be dissected by engineers. But what about the other 1,300 jets? The vast majority of the Forrest fleet was left behind. They were too damaged, too sabotaged, or simply too numerous to transport. The order was given, clean it up. American bulldozers moved in. They pushed the sleek, shark-like jets into massive piles. They crushed the wings. They shattered the fuselages. Then they poured gasoline on them. Huge bonfires lit up the German countryside. The miracle weapons that had terrified Allied bomber crews were melted down into puddles of aluminum. The Autobahn was cleared. The median strips were repaved with grass. The camouflage nets were pulled down. The forest airfields disappeared as quickly as they had been built.
1950, Korea. 5 years later, war broke out in Korea. High above the Yalu River, a new type of plane appeared, the American F-86 Sabre, and opposing it, the Soviet MiG-15. Both planes had swept wings, both had axial flow jet engines, both looked suspiciously like the children of the Messerschmitt Me-262. The DNA of the Autobahn airfields lived on. When you drive down the A8 Autobahn today between Munich and Salzburg, you are driving on hallowed ground. The trees have grown back, the taxiways are overgrown with moss, the bunkers are filled with dirt. But if you know where to look, you can still see the concrete pads in the woods. You can see the unnaturally straight sections of road. It is the only physical evidence left of the moment when the German Luftwaffe, broken and beaten, tried to hide the future in the forest. They hid 1,400 jets. They thought they could turn the tide, but in the end, they only built the world's most expensive junkyard.